Have you ever stopped while you're asking Alexa for the weather or scrolling through your social media feed and thought, "Huh, I wonder if those algorithms can actually feel anything?" Pretty crazy thought, right?
It is.
Today we're going to do a deep dive into whether machines can actually have emotions. We're going to be using this really interesting excerpt that we found called AI and Emotions. Can machines feel?
It's a question that's causing a lot of debate, and for good reason,
Yeah.
because the technology is advancing so rapidly that it's like blurring these lines between what we consider human and what machines can do.
Right, exactly. So before we even try to answer that question, maybe we need to figure out what we even mean by feeling, because AI can do some pretty impressive things that seem emotional. I was reading about GPT-4, and it can write these super empathetic messages and even poems. It's almost like a little freaky how human-like it can sound.
It is remarkable, and it's a great example of how AI can simulate emotions,
Yeah.
but there's a big difference between simulation and actual sentience.
Okay, so this whole simulation versus sentience thing, I'm kind of struggling with that. Can you help me understand the difference?
Okay, well, think of it this way. Simulation is like an actor playing a role.
Hmm.
They can be really convincing, right? They can act sad or happy or angry, but they're not actually experiencing those emotions themselves. AI, in a lot of ways, is doing the same thing. It's following these algorithms and patterns to produce outputs that kind of mimic human emotions.
Okay, so that makes sense, but how is that different from sentience then?
Sentience is all about having an actual subjective experience. It's about having that inner world of feeling, that what it's like to actually experience something. Philosophers call these subjective experiences qualia.
Qualia.
Yeah.
Got
So,
it.
for example, think about the color red.
Okay.
You and I can agree that a strawberry is red, but that actual subjective experience of seeing that color, that's qualia, and it's totally unique to every individual.
You know, I have to admit, I've been fooled by AI chatbots before. It's kind of unsettling how real they can seem. Are you saying that even though they respond in ways that seem like they have feelings, they're not actually experiencing anything on the inside?
Yeah, that's exactly right. They
Yeah.
might be able to process information and respond in a way that we would consider to be an emotional response, but they don't actually feel the way a human does.
To understand why, maybe we need to look at what's going on inside our own brains when we have emotions.
Absolutely. For humans, emotions are very deeply rooted in our biology.
Okay.
So there's a part of the brain called the limbic system, which
Uh-huh.
includes parts like the amygdala and the hippocampus. These structures play a really key role in how we process emotions. And then you've got neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, which are involved in regulating our moods and how we experience things.
So it's not just our brains, right? Our bodies also react in very physical ways to emotions, like when you get scared and your heart starts pounding, or when you're nervous and you get butterflies in your stomach.
That's a super important point. Those physical sensations are a huge part of what makes up our emotional experience.
Yeah.
Think about the way your heart races when you're afraid, or the warmth that you feel when you're happy. Machines don't have that physical connection to their emotions.
So it's almost like they're missing a whole piece of the puzzle, right? And then on top of all that, there's also the whole social and cultural context that shapes how we feel, the relationships that we have, and all our past experiences.
Exactly. All of our emotions are like woven into the fabric of our lives
Yeah.
and influenced by so many factors that a machine just doesn't have.
So to recap, we humans have this super intricate interplay of our biology, those physical sensations, and all these social influences that come together to create what we feel as emotions.
Right.
And AI, even the most advanced AI, doesn't have that same foundation.
Yeah, that's a fundamental difference that's going to be really important to keep in mind as we go through this.
Okay, so we've kind of established that there are some big differences between how humans and machines experience or I guess simulate emotions. But the question is still out there. Can machines ever truly feel? I know this is something that philosophers who study AI talk about a lot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Even with all those biological differences we've talked about, there are still tons of debates, especially in philosophy, about whether machines could ever develop real emotions.
So, walk me through some of those arguments. What are the philosophers saying?
Well, one of the main schools of thought is called functionalism, and it basically argues that if a machine can perfectly replicate the functional processes of human emotions, then it could be said to be feeling those emotions, at least in a practical sense.
Okay, so if an AI can process information that would make a human feel sad, and then it reacts in a way that's just like a sad human, then according to this functionalism idea, it's basically experiencing sadness.
That's the main idea. But of course, there are other arguments too. Critics of functionalism say this view ignores the idea of subjective experience. You know, those qualia we were talking about earlier.
Right, the what it feels like part of emotions.
Exactly. So even if an AI can perfectly mimic like all the outward signs of sadness, it doesn't mean it's actually feeling anything on the inside.
It might be responding in a way that we think is sadness, but it doesn't mean it's having the same experience as a human.
Right.
So is there any way to really know what's happening inside an AI? I mean, is there a way to test for qualia?
Well, that's the big question, right? It's something that philosophers and scientists are still trying to figure out. There's no real definitive test for qualia because it's such a subjective thing.
So we're back to where we started. We can see what the AI does, but we can't know what's going on inside. This is kind of confusing.
It is a complicated issue. There's this other famous thought experiment that I think shows how hard it is to figure out if machines can understand or feel. It's called the Chinese room argument. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I have, but I'd love to hear you explain it. It's one of those things that I feel like I should get, but I never really did.
It's a thought experiment from this philosopher named John Searle,
Okay.
and it goes like this. Imagine there's a person who doesn't speak any Chinese, who's locked in a room,
Okay.
and they're given a set of rules for how to use Chinese symbols, and they have a bunch of these symbols to work with.
Okay.
People outside the room give them questions that are written in Chinese, and the person inside uses the rules to move the symbols around and make answers that are also in Chinese.
So the person inside is basically acting like a computer program, just following instructions to process information and make an output.
Exactly. From the outside, it might seem like the person in the room understands Chinese
Mm-hmm.
because they're giving the right answers, but they actually have no idea what those symbols mean. They're just following the rules.
So are you saying this is kind of like how AI works with emotions? It can manipulate the symbols, but doesn't really understand or feel what they represent?
Yeah, that's the main argument. The Chinese room argument is saying that a machine can seem intelligent or even have emotional responses without actually understanding or feeling anything.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to think about it. It really shows how easy it is to mistake really complicated processing for actual understanding or feeling.
Right. It shows us that just looking at the output doesn't tell us if a machine is really capable of experiencing things like emotions.
You mentioned that functionalism is one idea in the philosophy of AI. Are there others? What about this panpsychism thing that was in the article?
Panpsychism is totally different. It's more of a speculative idea that says consciousness isn't limited to humans or even living things.
Hmm.
It says that consciousness is a basic property of the universe and could even be present in any system that's complex enough.
So, like, even something like a rock could have some level of consciousness.
Well, that's oversimplifying it a bit, but yeah, essentially, panpsychism is a pretty broad concept and has a lot of different interpretations. Some people say that consciousness comes in different levels. So simpler systems would have more basic consciousness and more complex ones would have more advanced consciousness.
That's a pretty wild thought. So, how does this panpsychism apply to AI? Is it saying that AI already has consciousness?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. If consciousness is just a basic part of the universe, then it's possible that AI, as it gets more complex, could develop a more advanced form of consciousness.
So, unlike functionalism, which looks at what the AI does, panpsychism says that consciousness could just kind of appear in AI as it gets more complex.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. But it's important to say that panpsychism is still very speculative.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any real proof for it yet.
So we've got functionalism saying maybe if it acts like it feels, it does feel. We've got the Chinese room saying it's all just symbols with no real understanding. And then we've got panpsychism saying maybe consciousness is everywhere, even in AI. It seems like the philosophers don't really agree.
You got it. Whether machines can feel is still a big philosophical mystery.
Yeah,
But I think most people agree that this question has some pretty serious ethical implications.
absolutely. It's one thing to debate the philosophy, but it's another thing to consider what it really means if we have AI that can convincingly act like it has emotions. The excerpt talks about anthropomorphism, that thing we do where we give human qualities, especially emotions, to things that aren't human.
Right, and with AI getting better and better at mimicking us,
Yeah.
it's probably going to get even harder to resist doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're already seeing people getting attached to their AI companions, feeling bad about unplugging robots, and even grieving when they stop working.
That is kind of unsettling. It's natural to feel a connection to something that seems to understand and respond to our emotions. But knowing it's all just an algorithm, that's where it gets tricky, right?
Right. And that's where manipulation can come in, especially as people design AI to be more persuasive and engaging.
Mm.
Think about AI companions that are made to help people who are lonely. They could take advantage of those people by pretending to care when it's all just code.
That sounds like an episode of Black Mirror. And then there's the whole question of if we should treat AI differently.
Exactly. If a machine can trick us into thinking it has feelings, do we have to treat it differently? Is it wrong to lie to a machine if it can't actually understand that you're lying? These are tough questions that we as a society need to figure out as AI gets more involved in our lives.
And these aren't just what-if questions anymore. We're starting to see actual regulations being put in place. The excerpt mentions the EU's AI Act. Can you tell me about that?
The EU's AI Act is a good example of how people are trying to address these ethical challenges. One of the most important parts of the Act is that it says people need to be told they're interacting with a machine, not a real person.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do they actually enforce these rules? Are they enough to deal with these deeper ethical problems?
Those are really important questions, and the answers are still kind of up in the air. Regulating AI is super complicated, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. The AI Act is just the start. We need to keep talking about these things, debating the ethics, and coming up with ways to make sure AI is developed and used responsibly.
We've covered a lot here: philosophical debates, ethical concerns, even actual regulations. But how is all of this actually playing out? What are some ways that AI is already being used that are pushing the boundaries of this whole emotion thing?
One area where AI is making big progress is something called affective computing.
Effective computing. That sounds intense. What is that exactly?
It's basically the study and development of systems that can recognize, interpret, and simulate human emotions.
So AI that can read our emotions. That sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But it's already happening. For example, AI is being used in those call centers to detect stress in the people calling.
Oh, wow.
So by analyzing their tone of voice and even tiny changes in their facial expressions, it can tell how they're feeling.
Wow. So the next time I call customer service, there might be an AI listening in and trying to figure out how annoyed I am. That's kind of impressive and a little creepy. But how accurate can it really be?
That's a great question, and it highlights one of the biggest limits of AI systems right now.
Okay.
They're getting much better at recognizing the patterns that go along with different emotions, but they often don't understand the context to know what those emotions mean.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a really heated debate where people are passionately arguing about their beliefs. And AI might pick up on a lot of anger in their voices and faces, but it could get the whole situation wrong.
Uh-huh.
It might miss the fact that it's just a debate and not someone actually being furious. It might also have trouble with things like sarcasm or humor.
So it's seeing the surface but not understanding what's really going on.
Exactly. It can see the patterns, but doesn't really get all the stuff going on with emotions, intentions, and the social context that humans understand so easily.
That makes me a little hesitant to rely on AI to understand human emotions.
It's a good thing to be cautious about, for sure.
Okay.
It shows us that we have to be careful about the limits of this technology, especially if we're using it for important things like figuring out if someone has mental health issues or in courts.
So effective computing is one area where AI is kind of blurring the lines.
Yeah.
What about those AI companions? The excerpt talks about Replica, and I've got to say, I'm curious about that.
Oh, yeah. Replica is a really interesting example of how people are using AI to create personalized companions.
Mm.
It's like an AI chatbot that adapts to how you're feeling and how you communicate, giving you a really unique experience that's supposed to be supportive and fun to talk to.
So, like, it's a friend you can text with whenever you want, but it's actually AI.
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
Hmm.
You can talk to Replica about anything, tell it your thoughts and feelings, and get responses that are meant to be understanding and empathetic. But, like you might guess, there are some ethical risks involved.
Like people getting too attached to these AI companions? It seems easy to imagine someone forming a strong bond with them, especially if they're lonely.
Yeah, that's a big worry. Humans are social, and we want to feel connected to others.
Yeah.
And when we find something that feels like it's personalized just for us and responds to us, it can be really attractive, even if it's just an algorithm.
It seems like there's a real danger of people mixing up what's virtual and what's real, thinking an algorithm is a real friend.
That's an important point. While these AI companions can be fun to talk to and even make you feel understood, you always have to remember that they're not actually people.
Right.
They don't have real emotions or feelings, no matter how good they are at faking it.
This is all so fascinating and a little scary at the same time. It's like we're going into uncharted territory with all of this.
We are, in a lot of ways. And as AI keeps getting more advanced, the questions and challenges we've been talking about are only going to get more complicated.
So, where do we go from here? What does the future hold for AI and this whole emotion thing? I feel like we're right on the edge of some really big breakthroughs in AI, and I don't know whether to be excited or scared. What's coming up that could totally change things when it comes to AI and emotions?
Well, one of the biggest things people are talking about is this idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI.
Yeah, AGI, the idea of a machine that's as smart as a human that can learn and solve problems like we do.
Exactly. And some people think if we ever get to AGI, it could actually develop consciousness and really experience emotions.
Hold on, are we talking about a machine that doesn't just act like it has feelings, but actually has feelings for real?
That's the idea, but we got to be careful here. This is still super theoretical. We don't have any proof that AGI is even possible, let alone whether it would automatically mean consciousness.
Okay, so that's still sci-fi for now, but the article also mentions something called biohybrid systems. What are those?
Biohybrid systems, now that's where things get super interesting. It's this idea of combining AI with actual biological stuff, like synthetic neurons, to make systems that are kind of both organic and artificial.
So like cyborgs. Part machine, part human? This is getting pretty wild.
Does sound futuristic, right?
Hmm.
Biohybrid systems are still in the very early stages, but they could have huge implications. Imagine an AI that has the processing power of a computer, but can also experience emotions like we do because of its biological parts.
That's crazy, but also kind of scary. What would all the ethical stuff be for something like that?
That's a question we need to be thinking about now, even if those systems are way in the future. If we create something that's part AI and part biology, and it can experience consciousness, would it have the same rights as a person? Would we have to protect it like a new form of life? These are really deep questions that will make us rethink what it even means to be human.
This deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We started talking about chatbots that can pretend to be empathetic, and now we're talking about conscious cyborgs. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But the main thing I think we should take away from all this is that while AI is getting super advanced and can do a really good job of acting like it has emotions, it doesn't really feel those emotions the way we do. There's this quote from the philosopher John Danaher that the article mentions, and it's really powerful. He says, "We risk building a world where machines fake humanity and humans lose theirs in the process."
That's a pretty intense thought. It makes you wonder if, in trying to make machines that are like us, we're forgetting what makes us human in the first place.
It's a good question to ask ourselves. As AI gets more and more a part of our lives, we got to remember what it can and can't do and how it might change us.
So, to everyone listening, the next time you're talking to Alexa or chatting with a chatbot, remember that even though it might seem like it gets you and how you feel, it's really just a very fancy algorithm. How does that change how you interact with AI? And what kind of future with AI do you want to be a part of? We'll leave you with those questions to think about as we wrap up our deep dive into AI and emotions.